Welcome to part 2 of episode 10 of season 1 of the Taking Back the Narrative podcast. So, to continue the topic, why Zionism Education needs an overhaul, I want to extend a sincere thank you to Naya Lekht, the Director of Education at Club Z. Thank you so much for coming back. And we've had a very comprehensive conversation in part 1, but there were a few topics that we didn't even get to. So I thought it was very beneficial to the audience. So I will start off with something that has truly been part of a discussion on my end, which is how to tackle religion and Zionism education. So I will start with I would say 2 real life examples that I've had. So when I was starting Taking Back the Narrative, my initiative, I originally was working with a partner. It didn't work out, no hard feelings. That's life sometimes. But this woman was a lot more religious and I'm secular. And so she really wanted to emphasize that, Israel belongs to the Jews because of God. Israel is so important because of religion. And as a secular Jew, of course, I respect religious Jews so much. I think it's beautiful. I sometimes wish I could be more religious. Not that outside forces are stopping me. It's a more personal journey that I'm on. And I've become a little bit more religious than I was before. But I noticed something that, when we as Jews say, Israel belongs to us because God promised us.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of other people who, let's say, are anti-Israel, and I've read this online, I've seen it happen in person, they'll say, well, Allah promised it to Muslims. Allah means God, right? It's not like a separate entity. So our God promised, their God, who's the same, entity, promised to them. A third group can come in and say like, oh, well, Israel belongs to this entity. And so to me, I think that devalues the absolute truth that Israel is the Jewish homeland. And so I always emphasize from a historical angle to prove the Jewish continuous presence, right? Because if we're looking at it from a religious only perspective and not as a peoplehood, right? A religion can be practiced anywhere, right? When Jews were, not all Jews, we were talking about this, many Jews actually stayed in Israel and had a rich, although oftentimes, of course, turbulent history in Israel between the second exile and Israel's liberation. But many Jews ended up on the Iberian Peninsula, and then eventually migrated to what we call now Eastern Europe, ended up in Persia, ended up in Iraq, right? And still practiced Judaism and practiced it strongly. So someone could say, well, why not establish Israel in France or near France? Or, Herzl at one point was so desperate, he said, okay, well, forget Israel. We can establish ourselves in Uganda.
Right.
Right. And I understand, like, from his point of view, again, the desperation, somewhere where there was refuge, but none of those places have any connection historically, genetically, of provenance to Jews, right? So it's only within Judea, and it's been proven, again, genetically, historically, archaeologically. So what do you think of that notion, right? So how much do you, in your own Zionism education, do you emphasize or even discuss the religious aspect of Israel and Jews and that connection?
Well, awesome to be back. So that's a really big question. And it's about audience a lot of the time. I think when you're speaking to, a lot of the times, my audience happens to be people whose parents are from the former Soviet Union, and they have sometimes even an adverse reaction to religion.
Mhm.
And they just don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. They think religion is outdated and it's fables. I really don't talk about it. Me personally, Naya, so I'm a walking hypocrite because I should be observing Shabbat. I should be a totally observant Jew because I 100% believe that we were promised this land by Hashem. So on a personal level, but so I'm wearing, you're asking me, I'm wearing a hat as Naya, the person, and then Naya, the Zionist educator. Naya, the Zionist educator, depends on who I'm speaking with. So if I'm speaking to an audience that it wouldn't resonate, I wouldn't talk about it. But there's another way to conceptualize all this, and that is if we treat the Torah as not, let's say, a religious text only, but as a Magna Carta, as a primary source document of a people, of an ethnic group, then you can't deny the centrality of the land. That is the primary source document. Every culture has their own primary chronicles. And in those primary chronicles, they really outline geographically what is their land. The Russians did this. They had their own primary chronicles, the Russians. Before it was Rus, it was Kievan Rus. And it was in the primary chronicles there where they outlined where their land was. The Torah can be treated and should be treated as this primary source document, as a historical document. So I have no problem with that. In regards to bringing in religion, it depends for what reason. If it's just you and me having coffee, we're not educating and we're just having conversation. I do believe that it was promised to us by Hashem. I believe that there are laws that we cannot practice as Jews outside of the land of Israel. They're literally, if you look at commandments and the way that Judaism as a religion is supposed to be observed, there are certain things we cannot do outside the land of Israel, which shows to me that it's really tied to the land. Obviously, our ethnic identity, our ethno-religious makeup is tied to the land. But again, for what purpose do we bring in this idea of religion and Zionism? It depends on the audience. It depends on the audience, is what I would say to you. It doesn't resonate well with former Soviet, FSU Jews, former Soviet Union Jews. They, for some reason, my own father has a real adverse reaction. Like when there was a time that my husband and I wanted to make a kosher kitchen, and my father almost had a heart attack because it was just, he does not want me to become observant at all. So that's just a reality within a large segment of Russian-speaking Jews. But one more thing I'll tell you, and when people, and you're right, a lot of people will say, you can't use the argument that Jerusalem or Judea is so important to Jews because of good, it was promised to them by God, yet they have no problem, accepting a narrative that Mecca is holy to the Arab people. So you can't do both. If you're gonna respect another religion, please respect the Jews.
I think that's such a great point. And your story is beautiful. See, as a secular Jew, I did not even know that there are some Judaic laws that cannot be practiced outside of Israel. And I would love to have an off-record conversation about that, just because I'm always willing to learn. And I think that that's so great, because I don't think unless someone's a great rabbi, it's impossible to learn everything about Judaism, even observant people. So I thank you for that. I'm coming also from a place. So again, most of my audience is not Jewish from what I'm seeing. And lately there's been not a debate, but more of an explanation that, and we were talking a little bit about this in our previous conversation, what happened, under Trump and how he revolutionized combating anti-Semitism. He recognized that Jews are a race. And so those are racist practices when someone attacks Jews for being pro-Israel, right? It's not just a religion. And a lot of people conflate that. Unfortunately, we even see that with what's been happening in the news with Kanye West and other Black entertainers who have been saying, well, Judaism is a religion, we converted. And we were talking a little bit off record about the convert aspect. So it's really hard, I think, for people outside of our nation as a whole, I would say, like in terms of us being Jews, to even conceptualize the fact that we are an ethno-religious tribe, right? So like we are a people that has a distinct faith, but we're not a religion. And even like my Chabad rabbi backed me up on this. He said, no, we're not an actual religion in the modern sense. We're
Right.
not Christianity, we're not Islam, because the one video I agreed with Rudy Rockman was, I don't know if you saw it, it was on YouTube, and I think it came out maybe like 7 years ago at this point. It said Judaism is not a religion. I was thinking, what is he talking about? And I was watching the video and it made sense. And he said, right, like you can take any person in the world who converts to Christianity, but they cannot call themselves a Christian unless they believe in Christ. You can convert anyone in the world to Islam. They're not Muslim unless they believe in the teachings of Muhammad. Whereas with Judaism, and I'm a prime example of that, even though I didn't even know that I was Jewish until I was a child, 7, 8 years old, I was always a Jew, right? That's just within my blood. And so whether I'm observant or not does not change who I am as an ethnicity. And so it is really hard. Like even my brother-in-law, who's been in our family for now 15 years from the start of meeting my sister, and who's not Jewish, he still has a hard time understanding. Like he still looks at Jews as just a religion, and he cannot grasp the fact that we are a people and
Yes.
why we have such a strong connection to Israel. Like he doesn't get it because he's half German, half Swiss, and yes, like he has an affinity for Germany, but it's not that strong. His family has been in America for multiple generations, and he'll sometimes say, and he's not anti-Semitic in the least, but sometimes he'll say like, why are you so obsessed with Israel? I'm like, well, first of all, there's a lot of hate about Israel, so I'd like to combat that. And I feel that connection that I don't feel anywhere else, right? Like we were talking about that in part one. So when people, I guess it bothers me a lot when people think that we're just a religion, and anyone can convert to become Jewish, and if anyone can convert to become Jewish, then how is Israel a homeland for Jews when basically like anyone can become part of our tribe, right? It's so much complexity involved with it.
I'll just really simplify it and say the following. If a Christian person one day wakes up and says, I no longer accept Jesus Christ, that's when they stop being a Christian.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
When a Jew wakes up and says, I'm going to be an atheist, they're a Jew.
There's actually a really funny story. Modi, the comedian, who's very much Jewish, he did a roast at Commentary Magazine, and he was roasting the journalist writer Andrew Clavin, who's a Jew, but he converted to Christianity. And Modi was roasting him. He was like, I don't understand this. So you convert to Christianity, but you're still Jewish, right? Like you have a Jewish neshama, like it's still a part of you.
Yes.
And it's true, right? Like like they say, like you can't take the city girl out of, you can take the city girl out of the city, but the city will always be part of the girl, right? So
That's what Jews are. That's the peoplehood.
Yes. It's the peoplehood, right? So I think you're right. It depends on the audience, and it just how to navigate it. But I recently had an interaction with someone who wanted to be on my podcast, and he said, I want to do an entire podcast how God just promised Israel to us, and that's the only explanation one needs. I also push back on that because I think that explaining Zionism from a historical perspective and archaeological, everyone processes information very differently. Like some people do, take to religion and understand that. Other people do not. Other people need evidence. So thank God for archaeology. Thank God for historical sites. And luckily, the Bible backs up a lot of the historical sites. Like anyone who can go to Israel can see it for themselves. So on that topic, I would like to now pivot to an equally semi-controversial debate, and that's politics, right? So unfortunately, from my perspective, I say unfortunately, Israel has become political in the United States, at least. I am not sure exactly when that happened. I can ascertain that for many decades, Israel, but both political sides were fairly neutral about Israel, maybe one being a little bit anti, but both. Like if you even look at how George W. Bush was towards Israel until 9/11 happened. Their administration wasn't too positive towards Israel. Then when he understood how much terrorism affects our everyday lives, then he started supporting Israel a bit more. But it was, I think both sides were fairly fair weather towards Israel until Trump entered the picture and obviously had a lot of pro-Israel policies. And so suddenly I'm seeing people who might not have necessarily been anti-Israel just because they don't have any issues with it, but because they're super Democrats, they can't be for something that the Republicans are for. And so to me, I'm trying to balance the two, right? I have very personal opinions on especially Jews who vote a certain way, whose party does not support Israel, actually, and it's an antagonist towards Israel. But I think for an educational purpose, to have left organizations like APAC has become right now, then you have J Street, which I don't know why they even consider themselves to be pro-Israel with all of their propaganda, false propaganda that they push. And then recently, my opinion of them has drastically changed, but up until a year and a half ago, you had the ZOA on the right. And then people will say, oh, well, if the ZOA said something, that can't be true because they're such a right-wing organization. Or if this organization said something, that can't be true because it doesn't align with my political beliefs. Personally, I'm trying my best to keep my educational materials as non-political as possible. Maybe I'll say something about the Oslo Accords, but people know who was in charge during the Oslo Accord times. It's very easy to figure that out. And I do that because it attracts the most audience, but I don't compromise on terminology, right? Like so many people will say to me, well, if you're going to have a left-leaning audience, then you have to say Palestinians, you have to say West Bank, you have to meet in the middle. And I'll say, no, I'm presenting the history of Israel on a platter. Whoever wants to take what they want from it is welcome to do that. And so far, TBTN has only been around for barely a year, but so far it's actually been working. And I think we talked about this a little bit in the past episode. My last intern was not just a Democrat, he was progressive. And I remember when I posted the position for a spring intern, I received maybe 15, 20 applications. And, of course, like you're reading through all the cover letters and all of them were on the same level. All of them were impressive, these college kids. But what stood out to me from his letter, why I decided to interview him, he said that, I'm a progressive, but I'm also a Zionist. And he wasn't even fully Jewish. He was half Irish, half Jewish. And he said it really bothered him that all of his friends and his family and everyone in his life was so anti-Israel. So at the very least, he wanted to at least learn the proper facts. So he went through the internship with me and he said, everything I'm learning, I'm sharing with my immediate community. And they're benefiting so much from that. And same thing with followers on Instagram, I found. You go to their pages, you kind of see where they lean. I would say it's about 60-40, with 60% being more left leaning. So it is hard, right? Because we don't want, and then when I say we, I mean in general, right? When you're leading an organization or being part of an organization, you also want to be expressive of your own personal views and how best to do that. And so like, of course, like I have a separate account for my personal page, but anyone can look up my name and see what I believe in, who I'm voting for, whom I'm against. So to me, that's something that's like a push and pull, right? It's like if I post something on my personal page, I want to be really careful that that doesn't even come into contact with my Taking Back the Narrative page, but also knowing that it's also public, it's out there. But it's interesting. So far, I haven't had any comments from anyone who's liberal who follows TBTN. I'm shocked, but so far no one has said anything. And I think it's because, and I know you follow me, on my initiative page, and you can tell I've not touched politics. Maybe I will at some point if it's necessary, but not right now. So to you, what do you think about organizations who sprinkle politics or who anchor politics into Zionism education? And do you think it is needed, or is it best to just stay away?
Another big one, another biggie. Um, and the truth of the matter is, I'm actually going to answer a different way for you. And that is, I believe that we are living in a time where everything is political.
Mhm.
Everything is political, even if you don't want it to be political. I'll give you an example. Okay, a real life example. If I address an audience and say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm being political because I believe in two genders. If I say boys and girls, I'm being political. We live in political, whether this is good or bad, personally, I think it's not great. But we've gotten to the point where language, for better or for worse, is a window into ideology. Now, you maintain that you try to be, factual, and that you try to be non-political. But when you say Judea and Samaria, you right away, I say it too. I say Judea and Samaria. I just jumped off a call with someone who has years and years of experience in teaching in the Israel space. And he told me that he's not super comfortable with the term Judea and Samaria because it immediately pits him onto the right-wing Zionists. Mm-hmm. And he used the settlers. So whether, right, you shake your head, I also, but that's just the reality, that we think it's not political, but it is already. It's just the sad scenario of the state of affairs, that once somebody opens their mouth and starts to use certain words, the fact that I can predict the end of their sentence is really not a good sign of where we're at. So for instance, if I know somebody wants to dismantle systems of oppression and is fighting against inequity, I already know where they stand politically. So what I know that a lot of, but the thing is, a lot of Zionist or Israel educators want to be as bipartisan as possible. They do not want to bring politics. They do not want it. But because of where we're at, where we are living in this time right now, where everything is political, our language is signaling at all times a certain political perspective, or as I say, ideology, makes it so that even if you yourself think that you're just presenting facts to the receiver on the other end, you are already making a political statement. I mean, he told me today that he's uncomfortable with that. That's settler language.
Do you think that we also set that tone? Because I've shared, I won't share the name though. I do respect her and she's my friend, but I had someone who was on my advisory committee and she had said, I'm not comfortable using certain language because I have liberals on my board. And I said to her, but this is your organization, so why don't you set the tone? So how much of it is that we, those of us who are educators, are afraid to, even though it may sound political, to use that correct terminology, to the point where if enough of us use that terminology, it becomes part of everyday parlance, as opposed to that quote unquote boogeyman term. Oh my gosh, he said Judea and Samaria. Oh my gosh, like he said Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, as opposed to settlement, right? So that's how I'm seeing it, because I'm coming from a different perspective. I was anti-Jewish for 20 years. And of course, and once I became a Zionist, I was saying, oh, it was the media's fault. It was only the media. But then I really analyzed the situation. I realized it wasn't just the media's fault. It was also many other Jews who were using that incorrect terminology. And that's what I picked up on, right? So when they were saying settlements, to me, that was and is a very negative term. When they were saying West Bank, I knew that that was a negative term. And so I processed it as such. And once I became a Zionist, like I realized how incorrect that was. And I said to myself, okay, it's up to me. Maybe it won't reach such a wide audience. Maybe I'll lose. And I did, I lost a lot of friends. Sadly, I lost a couple Muslim friends, but for the most part, it was Jewish friends on the left who
Yes.
exited our friendship, and it was painful. But I said to myself, it's worth losing those friends to share the truth. And again, we all have different experiences, right? So like for my experience, like just having that time with that intern who was progressive, he knew I was a Trump supporter. He knew everything. And he didn't care, right? He didn't say like, oh my gosh, like you're an evil person because you voted for, Trump and you are so pro-Israel. He was there for an open mind, just to learn. And he learned. And he would even say, he's like, oh my gosh, I've never heard of that term before. He never even heard about Judean spirit, and neither did I. And it wasn't that I even learned in 2014 when I became a Zionist. I didn't learn Judean Samaria until 2016. It took 2 years of being pro-Israel to even learn that correct terminology.
See,
Yeah.
that to me is just, again, a very sad reflection on the state of affairs of Israel education.
It really is, right? And where was I being educated? Online. And so a lot of the people that, because I was dropped by so many anti-Israel people, I became friends with this vast community of pro-Israel people. Not all of them educators, of course, but like, educating in their own fashion online. Even to this day, I will push back on people, and it's many on my social media platforms who will use that incorrect terminology. And a few of them have started reverting to using correct terms. And they said it was so hard to make it part of my everyday language. But once I did, I could never go back. So it's interesting, like how our mental prominence of presenting facts factors into this as well.
Agreed. Yes.
Yeah. And so something I wanted to talk to you about too is, I see a lot of young people online who are dabbling their foot a little bit into Zionism education and doing it in different ways. Some people do more pushback on incorrect videos that they're seeing from so-called Palestinian activists. Other people do it more from a cheerleading perspective. I call them Zionism cheerleaders, which are needed too. Like, I love Israel, Israel's great. But then I see others who will post that they're pro-Israel, but then repeat anti-Semitic tropes about Israel that we were just like talking about, right? Like, oh, like Israel and Palestine can coexist together. And I'm just thinking, where the hell is Palestine? Please explain this to me. Or, the Palestinians and the Jews. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, there's like 7 groups of those who are considered Palestinians. Like, you're not educating your audience. And then I think back, I also made mistakes when I first started. And like I mentioned, like I didn't even know Judean Samaria was a term until 2 years after I started. And I think back also to an article that I had wrote. It was my first op-ed in 2019. It was a pushback to Rashida Tlaib, and it was called "If My Great Uncle Was a Palestinian Jew, Who Are You?" Rashida Tlaib. And rereading the article, I kind of cringe a little bit, to use a very modern term, because I had written that it was Arafat that had renamed Arabs Palestinians in 1964, because that was my information back then. That's wholly incorrect. It was the KGB who invented that term, that liberation movement, in 1967. And again, like I didn't even know that until like years later. And so like I now go back and I'm like looking at my posts from 2014 to 2015, all the way to basically 2020, when I learned that piece of information. So I'm thinking, why, and I think this is great to discuss. Like, did you make any mistakes when you were first starting out in Zionism education? What mistakes are you seeing right now in the space that you would like to correct?
Okay. Whew, you ask like deep questions. So in terms of mistakes that I have made. Um, I think that we, and myself included, do not have a great game plan as Jewish people, and we're still on the defense.
Mhm.
We are uncomfortable being on the offense. We are uncomfortable saying, you know what, I'm sorry, there's a problem over there, and don't you dare even bring up us. We're not the oppressor. Like, if you look at college activities on campus, Israel activities, they're reactive. They're very reactive. And I was that student as well. We're not very good, it seems, at being proactive.
Mhm.
We're not good at knowing our own story and narrative and shouting it from the rooftops. We're just not, and I include myself in that. Yes, I'm an unapologetic Zionist, but why do I have to wait for an anti-Semitic event to say that? And I've said this, we've fallen asleep at the wheel and woke up, and somebody's driving, and we're going down this like really dangerous pathway, almost down the cliff, and we don't know how to take back the wheel. To your point, why are these activists saying really things like the Palestinians are indigenous and the Jews? And I think it's coming out of wanting to be seen as empathetic. They want to be seen as bringing human aspects to the conflict, to bring back humanity. It's actually to the detriment, honestly, to talking about this, as you say, war on the Jews. You don't call it the conflict, which to me, I loved it, by the way. And I actually shared it with my teens the other day, and they were like, wow, that's so interesting, the way that you described it. They want to see the good in everyone. They're good people with intentions, and they're driven by a value of empathy. They want to be empathetic, and that is what I think is these reasons that they are saying these educationally incorrect things. Like you say, where is Palestine? Like, a lot of my students to this day go, the Palestine-Israel conflict. I'm like, well, time out. Like, where is Palestine? Like, wait, time. Like, we can't even have that conversation. I'm not going to let you can call me a stifler. You can call me rigid, but we can't talk about these things. We need to address erroneous claims. But they don't want to feel bad, because it doesn't feel good to, the following, they say, well, we as Jews ask for self-determination. Why don't we afford the Palestinian Arabs the self-determination? So they want, in their act of kindness and empathy that drives them, they are reaching out their hand and saying, I believe that you have a right for self-determination. That's what they're doing when they say that. No, and here's the thing. I'm not here to solve any land disputes. Mm-hmm. What I do know, and I only know the past, is that that several proposed states where there could be full self-determination were refused. One time by the Peel Commission, next time by the UN, next time by Ehud Barak, where basically they came to Yasser Arafat and gave him 97% of Judea and Samaria, and he said no. That's when I start to question, does the other side want self-determination? And is it going to come at the cost to my people? Yes, I'm sorry. I'm going to first think of my family.
I think you bring up so many great points. And so I was where those misguided students were a decade ago, if not even sooner than that. And what stemmed from that is miseducation, right? Like, when you think there is a Palestine, when you think that there are Palestinians, what we were talking about during part one, every group has a homeland. So right. Where the hell is this homeland, right? And so you look at these false maps of Palestine ensconced within Israel, Judea and Samaria. But then when you do the research, and I think so, and it's both a mistake and I think an opportunity for change within our space, especially for those who are starting out. So when I started out, I really credit all of these, and it's so sad that these were secret Zionist groups on Facebook, but I'm glad that there were so many of them. Oh my gosh, I must have been part of no fewer than 15. And so all those groups were a little bit different, right? Like one was focused a little bit more on history, one was focused a little bit more on Jewish genetics, one was focused on archaeology, like everything. And I was picking up so much information. And it really painted this entire picture of Israel, of Jewish history, of our peoplehood. And then upon doing more and more research, you realize, oh my gosh, so what is Israel now that we call like our homeland? It's only 22% of what actually was legally promised to us in 1920 in the San Remo Accords. So if people don't know about the San Remo Accords, and I
Yep.
will venture to guess, maybe 10% of Zionism educators even know about the San Remo Accords, and I will blame myself. So again, started in 2014, didn't even hear about the San Remo Accords maybe until 2017, 2018, if that. So when
Mhm.
you don't know about the San Remo Accords, I mean, obviously I'm not talking about you yourself, people. So if
I
you
didn't
don't,
know. I didn't either until I came to Club Z. I really didn't. And it was the founder, Masha, who said, you need to learn about this. I didn't know about it either. So I didn't until about 4 years ago.
so exactly, so that's my point. So like when we don't know about the San Remo Accords, you don't know about the legality of Israel. So when before I knew about the San Remo Accords, I'm thinking, okay, I know that there's Jordan, I know that there's Israel, there's a space in between that must be for the Palestinians. Why are they fighting us? They have some land, do they need more land? And then you read and learn history and you realize, wait, Churchill lobbed off 78% of the Jewish homeland. And it was
Earmarked it for the Jews.
no, he lobbed off
Oh,
and
lopped off. You have to the Transjordan, right?
gave it to the right, gave it to the Arabs as like a gift to a Saudi family for
Right.
helping, for helping Great Britain during World War II.
Right.
I'm so sorry, during World War One. And so when you realize that, and of course you start to question, like, okay, so they promised this land, but I know that Jews lived in Israel. But then you read more, and it says it was based on tribal lands, right? So when you look at where the Jewish tribe actually lived, they lived well into Jordan, into what is now Jordan.
Correct.
That's why today the Jordanians are still finding Jewish artifacts. That's why
Correct.
today there's, I forgot
The
which,
greater kingdom of Israel went east of the Jordan.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And I forgot which kavar, how do you pronounce it? Like, what's the Hebrew word for burial site?
Caver.
That caver. I forgot which one it was, but there's some kind of important caver in Jordan. And it's so sad when I saw on Instagram that there was a group of Jews who had to dress as Arabs to even get into that site in Jordan because they couldn't come into Jordan with kippahs and talit. And they could only be there, I think, secretly for an allotted period of time. So when you learn that, the Palestinian Authority is not a legitimate government. It is a terrorist organization that was only legitimized through the Oslo Accords, which I personally call the Oslo Terrorist Accords. I won't say the terrorist accords on my initiative site, but one can tell how messed up that was. Then you understand that, and then also to that end, knowing that that Jordan resettled a lot of their people into Judea and Samaria during the 19-year occupation period between 48 and 67. After they ethnically cleansed the area of Jews, they expelled most, murdered some, right? So then who are these people? What about the Jewish families, the Jewish clans who
Mm-hmm.
were forcibly converted, right, during the Ottoman Empire
Mm-hmm.
to be Muslims? It was really sad to learn. I learned it from Dr. Wormser, who's one of the top Middle East experts. And he told me, did you know that some of the most notorious terrorists are actually from those Jewish clans? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, think about it this way. When they were being converted, they had to show fealty to their new religion, to their new culture. And the way they were forced to show fealty is by murdering Jews. And so that tradition, unfortunately, has trickled down to even today's generation. We're talking about, what about the Arabs into that area who were freely imported under the Ottoman Empire, under the British occupation, And the Ottoman Empire stopped Jewish immigration into Israel in 1882, completely stopped. And then they encouraged the Arabs to come in.
Mhm.
Once that comes into play, I think it becomes far easier to be on the offense, to your point we were talking about. And so one story, I really think it's so important to share. So again, I'll mention his name because he has flip-flopped on Israel, and I'm very free to share that, is Rudy Rockman. I think he did great work in the beginning, and now he's on radio stations talking about two sides and Jews and Palestinians, and it's like Israel's fault that we're not doing enough to help I mean, I'm in complete shock, as are a lot of other people. And then I look back and I remember being so impressed that he was with SSI on Columbia's campus. I believe this was 2000, maybe 14, 15. And there was apartheid week and he was there at a table. He was arguing with an Israeli religious Jew who was being anti-Israel. And all he kept saying was, Jews are a beautiful people, Israel's beautiful. And at the time that impressed me. I was like, wow, doing such great Zionism. And next to him was Mohammed Kabia, who's my absolute favorite Zionist, who happens to be a Muslim. And he schooled that Israeli religious Jew with facts and history more than Rudy did.
Mm.
He just, I mean, I'll send you that video and maybe I'll try to link it. It was amazing. He literally pointed out why Jews are not occupying Israel, how Jews should be proud of their homeland. They have no other, I mean, he just went on and on. That is exactly highlights your point. That's being on the offense with reality and facts. Tabling at a college and saying humus, not Hamas, doesn't do anything.
Oh my God, you don't even understand the frustration. No, but that in our previous conversation when we spoke, here is a demonstration with fake blood saying Israel has blood on its hands. Here is apartheid walls. And what are these Hillel? And I'm sorry, at that time in my university, they were creating paper doves with messages that said shalom and putting them up in the sky. And I wanted to tear here's people who are calling for your murder. I'm sorry, they are. And you are sending love notes, peace notes. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. The strategy on college campus is so infuriating to me that why I even went to Club Z, because I initially was asked to work on certain programs on college campus. I didn't want to touch college campuses because they were oversaturated and they were all, I thought, doing the wrong thing. And who am I to go and tell them? I'm so glad to see SSI and the work that they're doing. But why are we waiting to be proud when there's an anti-Israel event? Why are we not proud 24/7?
And I will reserve judgment because I've not seen, the last time I was in grad school was 2013 when I graduated, and I know that SSI was just very, very beginning back then, but I've not heard what educational aspects they're doing. All I see are videos that they're tabling at apartheid week presentations, anti-Semitic presentations, and just being open.
They don't do education.
Right. So I'm just confused with what they actually do.
Again, I'm not their representative. Okay. From observation, I think that what they do is grassroots activism. So for them, they're like, are you a proud Jew? Are you on campus? Do you want to do things? Do you want to get, excuse my language, SHIT done? Mm-hmm. We're going to come to you. We're going to give you anything you want and you go and table. The problem with that is if you don't have strong knowledge behind you and you're out there tabling and you don't know the nuances, you don't know the rich history, you can get yourself into trouble. Not like, you could look like a fool is what I'm saying. It's easy to look like a fool when you don't fall back on really understanding. I break down in our curriculum the 5 claims to Israel, the historic claims, the temporal claims, the religious claims, the ancestral indigenous claims, and the legal claims. And these 5 claims, you need to really know them in and out. Mm-hmm. And at any time that you're interacting with someone, you need to assess the situation, and use those claims immediately.
That's so true. And what you said is completely on point. How can someone be a Jewish activist when we don't know our history? And so I bring up SSI because I had reached out to the founder a couple times. And one time we had a phone conversation. And I said, you know what, I've been on your website. Why are all the terms on your website incorrect? And so he said, okay, fine. So you can correct them. Well, I said, like, first of all, there's going to be a contract. I'm not doing this for free. But like, second of all, are you open to this? And then I never heard back. And so I think it's great to say, like, you know, we're proud Jews. But then, like you said, like when you're confronted with absolute lies, how are you going to correct that? Being a proud Jew doesn't do anything. What are you going to say? Like, oh, I love being a Jew. Well, you're a killer. You are, you know, you hate Muslims, this, that. How are you going to respond with actual facts?
Well, here's a challenge for me, and I think for you. I think you and I are very similar in that we have high standards. We hold the Jewish community to high standards in terms of their education.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I've had people push back on me and say, Naya, you're letting great stand in the way of good.
Mm-hmm.
Your perfectionism, your desire for people to speak a certain language is standing in the way of good. And I've never really had a great response to, I mean, on the fly to that. And even my own husband, you know, when we discuss my frustrations within the Zionist space, because he knows I'm a very idealistic person. And I do hold myself and the Jewish community to very high standards. You know, his point is, and this is what he says to me, he says, you have two choices. He says, you have one choice is that you bring a kid into a Jewish organization that where they hear 30% pride, 70%, let's say, not the most correct information, or this Jewish kid knows nothing and goes to some anti-Israel event. Wouldn't you want them at least to come for 30% of truth? And I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
So on one hand, I do agree, right? So we all had to start somewhere. Like you said, like, you know, you were making some mistakes in the beginning, even though you were, you know, you are like very Jewish and religious. I certainly made a boatload of mistakes. But I think that when we coddle people and say, okay, yes, like you can be proud Jewish, but you can also say West Bank and settlements and Green Line and Palestine and Palestinians, that is reinforcing anti-Semitic hate, right? Like every Jew that's being murdered in Israel, like every terrorist attack, why is that? It's done in the name of lies, because those terrorists like actually believe that Jews are evil, that we have stolen their families, their cultures, homeland, and we're occupying their space. So when we as Jews especially use those terms, that contributes to those attacks in a way, right? Like I wrote a whole article called The Semantics of Anti-Semitism, where I break down like why it's not just words, those words end up in actions against Jews. Mm-hmm. And of course, like sometimes, you know, Arabs are killed also. And I think I'm coming from a very different place just because I was so anti-Israel, you know, for 20 years. And I mentioned in part one, I was repeating all those lies to many non-Jews. And then they would have a very specifically negative opinion about Israel, thanks to me. And because it was coming from a Jew, it legitimizes it.
Legitimizes.
Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think, well, and I think there's, so on one hand, your husband's right. Like if you're having a participant come, there's less expectations. But when you're having someone who labels themselves as a Zionism educator, that is when expectations have to be higher, right? Mm-hmm. Like I don't hold those standards. Of course, like if I hear my friends say, oh, something West Bank, I'm not going to go attack them. You know, I'll correct them very gently. But when someone is posting weekly, daily, says that they're a Zionism educator, and then uses that incorrect terminology, they're going to get a message from me with like, why not? And I think that, you know, I think that's some of the advice that I think we can impart on the future generation that's now starting out is before really posting a lot, do your research. right? And not just from one source. Like I know even, oh my gosh, it was a nightmare and a half to compiling all the research for my initiative because I didn't want it coming from only a Jewish source, but then you go to non-Jewish sources, they have a different version of history. I went to JSTOR to get academic sources. 95% of those sources were incorrect. In fact, this is really hysterical. I thought when I did research on the Ottoman Empire, I found more correct information regarding Israel by a Turkish by a Turkish professor than I did from any Israeli professor that was on JSTOR. Had no idea. I was like, oh, well, I didn't know this and that and that. So I think getting a variety of sources is really important because then, someone can say like, oh, well, that's just from a Jewish perspective. And then the Zionism educator can come back and say, well, it's actually from across the board. It's Jewish, it's non-Jewish, it's secular, it's more from a religious. And, and I have sources from Chabad, I have sources from the Jewish Virtual Library, I have sources obviously from like the Israel, I think some kind of Israel government sites, but I also have sources from Britannica. I have sources from archaeological magazines. Like one of the best articles I've ever read that I've incorporated to my initiative was Segula magazine. Like who's heard of them? Like I've never. It's such an esoteric site. And they did this great article called The Battle of Haifa. Never heard of the Battle of Haifa at all. Like what are they talking about? I read it. It was fascinating. In 1100 CE or AD, for those who are not Jewish, there was this great crusader battle against Israel, right? They were trying to invade. And so the Jews and Muslims of Haifa held the crusaders back for a month. And that might not sound impressive, but considering how few people were in the area and how many crusaders were coming, that is impressive. And so when historians went back a little bit later to see who were these Jewish and Muslim warriors that were fighting together against the crusaders, they actually found that it was majority Jews because it was much more Jews than Muslims in the Haifa vicinity. That's such a great information. So, and that's what made me add, okay, so there was this continuous presence of Jews, right? Like Jews were there in 200 CE, 400 CE, something happened in 800 CE, 1100, like, I mean, there was like not one century when I was compiling my continuous map that didn't have some kind of significant Jewish event in Israel. So I think that's so important to do research. And even now, right? Like I've been doing this for 8-9 years, even I'm learning facts. I'll give an example. I'm compiling class material for upcoming classes, Zionism education classes I'm doing. And there's this section on the rich Jewish history of Gaza. And I knew a little bit before, I did some research last year, but doing more and more research, I just made 9 slides about the Jewish presence in Gaza out of a 24 slide presentation, 9 just on that topic. So it's
right. I think that you're absolutely right. It has to start with intellectual curiosity and reading and going down those rabbit holes and learning as much as you can from various sources. Absolutely. You're right.
And I think like appeasing, and I think this is the last, I guess, advice that I have for anyone, especially those who are starting out. And it's something that I grappled with too, because I know like and by the way, and this is really interesting to say, I was anti-Arab for many years. And like, it's easy to understand why. Like you see terrorism attacks, who are the perpetrators? They're Arabs, right? They're not like Jews who are doing this. So for years and years and years, I was anti-Arab, I was anti-Muslim. As I'm becoming a stronger Zionist, I'm becoming more pro-Arab and more pro-Muslim, which is very interesting for me.
That's very interesting.
And the reason why is because I am much more confident in my Jewish, not just in Jewish history. I understand more Arab history, right? Like I understand it's not all Arabs, and look at, okay, I'll give a great example. The Ottoman Empire, right? Lasted 400 years. The Ottomans, for much of that time, much of that 400 years, we're perfectly fine towards Jews in Palestine. They didn't touch us, right? Like the Jews in Gaza were free, could do anything they wanted. There was no discrimination.
Mhm.
Only like very recently. There was, I mean, if you look at the history of Christianity against Jews, far more violent. And of course, like I'm not discounting the Farhud or the Dhimmi
Right.
status that Mizrahi Jews lived under. Of course not. And that's definitely worth mentioning, and I do. But to say that Islam is terrible, Muslims are awful, and Christians were fine, like that's also not true. So, and then,
I really agree with you.
right. And then also, I think it's fascinating to learn about the Arabs that helped the Jews
Yes.
in many wars, right? Like I didn't know that there were Bedouin tribes that pledged their allegiance to Israel. There was this great video of Moshe Dayan in 67. He already had his eye patch. People think like he lost his eye in 67. It wasn't, it was before. And I forgot where it was, but he obviously was in an Arab town, and he walked over. There was maybe 20, 30 Arab sheikhs sitting around saluting him. He saluted them. And then they were talking about all of the Bedouin trackers that they were going to recruit for a war. I mean, it's fascinating.
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, or like Muhammad Kabia. Like I keep going back to him.
Yeah, no, he's wonderful. I've seen him on social media. He's
Yeah.
absolutely wonderful.
If anyone's listening to this who's interested in befriending Muslim Zionists, I mean, there's so many, but he's definitely my top. And so he said in one of his posts, he shared in one of his posts that he's pro-Israel for so many reasons, but he said one of the main reasons because his clan, and when we talk about clans, we're talking about hundreds of people. It's not just, like 20, 30 people. His clan made a pact with Jews before Israel was liberated. And so he feels this inner connection to the Jewish people that cannot be shaken.
Wow.
That is so powerful.
Right.
Like I kind of wish that a lot of American Jews would
Yeah.
feel that pact. So I just think that again, like, so for me, my top four takeaways would be the following for those getting into the Zionism space and who are calling themselves publicly Zionism educators. First of all, be confident in your facts. So that includes doing a lot of research. And that also includes doing research on the negative side, like what is being said about Israel and knowing how to combat that. Second of all, not to appease. You're going to lose friends, and that's fine because that's part of the process. So not to compromise. Number three is to be very mindful of I guess this, like to be mindful of words, right? Like I'll see like posts where people will say like, very correct information, then they'll go back and forth in comments and they'll say, oh, both sides. So to be consistent, I think that's what I meant, to be consistent. And then to be in it for the long game, like not to just be in it for 15 minutes of fame, which I've seen plenty of people do. And then those are the people who suddenly just disappear. And you're thinking like, what happened to that person? What happened to that person? We should not be doing this for, like, first of all, like, how are we getting famous off of this, right? Like we should be doing this because we're trying to combat anti-Semitism, not for your video production capabilities. So those would be my takeaway. And then also to partner with the right people. Like I was doing it alone for so many years and I realized we're stronger together, but then finding people that you respect to partner with.
As you're speaking, I'm like, I don't know what to add. You are literally my twin on the East Coast.
That's what I feel. And that's like, I feel so comfortable with you and I respect you so much because I see the work that you do. And obviously I've seen your post and that speech that you gave during the AZM conference. And it's just so great to have people to look up to because sometimes it's been pathetic, to say the least, that I had these great names that I was looking up to even 3-4 years ago, and they have just fallen in my respect because they're no longer strong, they're no longer, using the proper terminology. They're now appeasing more. And these are some major names that I no longer respect. So to have, I don't know, like it's not that I respect so few people in the space, but I'm very selective whom I do respect. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
I mean, I have nothing like what you're saying. I don't have anything like to add because everything you say, I completely agree with.
Yeah. So, but I think too, but what I do like, I want to end this on a positive note, where like not everything's negative that we're talking about. I absolutely love that this new generation, this Gen Z generation, is using the term Judean so much. I see it all over social media.
Yes.
And that it gives me the best chills when I see that. I'm like,
Yes.
oh my gosh, I'm a Judean. Like someone the other day like was arguing with me. They're like, oh, look, I don't see she, her pronouns on your LinkedIn page. Why is that? And I said, because I'm a Judean and that's my pronoun.
Right. Zionist. That's my pronoun.
I love it. So I want to say thank you so much for your time. And I think anyone who wants to get in the space, I think you're a fantastic source. Welcome to contact me as well. And although I mean, I consider you pretty much an expert, I don't consider myself an expert because I'm still, I'm constantly learning. I've only been doing this for less than a decade. My initiative is
Which is longer than me, by the way.
not even a year old, but like still, I think there's so much to do. And quite honestly, I don't think that we as a community have not exhausted the possibilities.
Agreed. I think that we have a lot more amazing work to do, and I'm very happy there are people like you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we'll definitely keep working and keep pushing the truth about Israel out there and about the Jewish people too.
Right.
All right. Have a good
All
night.
right. Bye.